Before the story begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, so you don't miss more emotional and surprising stories ahead. And now let's dive into today's story. Did you enjoy pushing your own mother out of your life, Daniel? I asked my son over the phone, and the silence that followed told me everything I had been too afraid to admit for the past 3 years. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I'm 68 years old, and until recently, I believed family loyalty meant something sacred. I believed a son remembered the woman who raised him, the woman who worked double shifts at a diner so he could go to college, the woman who sat beside hospital beds and football fields and graduation stages without ever asking for anything in return. But somewhere along the way, my son stopped seeing me as his mother. And I think the moment he married Vanessa, I slowly became an inconvenience they both learned to tolerate instead of love. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from because sometimes the loneliest stories travel farther than we expect. The morning everything changed started quietly enough. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows while I stood making coffee in the little townhouse I'd rented after selling my family home 2 years earlier. The same home Daniel grew up in. The same home Vanessa had once called too outdated for modern living. While smiling politely across my Thanksgiving table, I remember wrapping my cardigan tighter around myself that morning because the heat in the townhouse never worked quite right when the temperature dropped below 50 degrees. My doctor had warned me to avoid the cold because of my arthritis, but replacing the old system wasn't something I could afford on my retirement checks. Still, I told myself I was fine. I always told myself that. The kitchen clock read 7:14 a.m. when my phone rang. Daniel's name flashed across the screen, and for a moment, my heart lifted the way it used to when he was young and called just to tell me about his day. But those calls had become rare after Vanessa entered his life. Conversations turned shorter. Visits became obligations squeezed between vacations, work dinners, and weekends with her family. The last time I saw my son in person was nearly 8 months ago at a restaurant downtown where Vanessa spent most of dinner checking her phone while Daniel talked about stock investments I barely understood. "Mom," he'd said back then, "you worry too much. Vanessa just likes things organized." Organized. That was the word he always used whenever she excluded me from something. Organized vacations I wasn't invited to. Organized holidays that somehow changed dates without anyone telling me. Organized family photos where I stood at the edge like an afterthought. My fingers trembled slightly as I answered the phone. "Daniel." There was hesitation on the other end. Not grief. Not warmth. Hesitation. "Mom," he finally said, his voice lower than usual. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." I stared out the rain-covered window at the empty parking lot below my building. Something inside me tightened immediately. "What is it?" Another pause. Then he spoke the sentence that shattered the last fragile version of the family I thought I still had. "Did you tell Vanessa's father I paid your rent for the last 2 years?" For a second, I genuinely thought I had misunderstood him. I leaned against the kitchen counter and tightened my grip on the phone while the coffee maker hissed softly behind me. "Excuse me?" I asked quietly. Daniel exhaled heavily, the way he used to when he was frustrated as a teenager and trying not to lose his temper. "Vanessa's father called me last night," he said. "Apparently you told him I have been financially supporting you because you cannot take care of yourself." I stared at the rain sliding down the glass. Outside, an elderly man in a red jacket walked a small beagle through the parking lot, completely unaware that my entire world was shifting again. "Daniel," I said slowly, "I have never said that to anyone." Silence. Then a short, skeptical laugh from my son. Not warm. Not kind. Skeptical. "Mom, he knew the exact amount." My stomach tightened. "What amount?" "The $2,400 a month." I closed my eyes. $2,400. That was nearly double my monthly income. "Daniel," I whispered, "you have never paid my rent." Another silence followed, longer this time. I could hear faint movement in the background on his end. Cabinet doors. Footsteps. Vanessa's voice somewhere farther away, low and irritated. Then Daniel spoke again, but his confidence had shifted slightly. "That is impossible." "No," I replied softly. "What is impossible is that my own son believes I would lie about something like this." My voice surprised even me. Calm. Controlled. The kind of calm that only comes after years of swallowing disappointment until it hardens into exhaustion. I walked slowly toward the small dining table near the window and sat down in the chair where I usually paid bills every Sunday evening. The table only seated 2 people. I bought it after selling the house because there was no reason to keep a 6-seat oak dining set when nobody visited anymore. "I thought you were doing better financially," Daniel muttered. "Vanessa told me you said you finally felt stable." I let out a quiet breath through my nose. Vanessa. Of course. Suddenly, little moments from the past 2 years began lining up in my mind with painful clarity. The Christmas card Daniel sent with only his signature because Vanessa forgot to include hers. The birthday flowers that arrived with no note attached. The awkward dinners where Vanessa insisted on paying the restaurant bill before I could even reach for my purse, only to mention later how expensive everything had become. Even the townhouse. Daniel believed I could afford it comfortably because Vanessa had told him I was receiving money every month. But I had been clipping grocery coupons, wearing the same winter coat for 4 years, skipping my physical therapy appointments because Medicare did not cover enough. "Daniel," I asked carefully, "who exactly has been receiving that money?" The line went completely still. I could almost hear his mind turning. "What are you saying?" he asked finally, though his voice no longer sounded defensive. It sounded afraid. I looked down at my hands resting on the table. My wedding ring still sat on my finger even though Harold had been gone for 6 years now. Some habits survive grief because removing them feels too permanent. "I am saying," I answered slowly, "that somebody has been lying to you for a very long time." Daniel did not answer right away. I could hear the faint creaking of floorboards on his side of the call, followed by the muffled sound of a door closing somewhere nearby. Then everything became quiet again. The kind of quiet that feels heavier than shouting. "Mom," he said finally, slower this time. "Vanessa handled most of our finances after the wedding. She told me she was transferring money to you every month because you were struggling after selling the house." I lowered my eyes toward the stack of unopened grocery ads sitting beside the fruit bowl on my table. The irony almost made me smile. For 2 years I had stretched every dollar while my son believed he was rescuing me from poverty. "Daniel," I said gently, "if you had ever sent me that kind of money, do you really think I would still be living in a townhouse with leaking windows and a broken heater?" He did not respond, but I knew he was picturing it now. The narrow kitchen, the worn carpet near the stairs, the old sedan I still drove because buying another car would mean touching the small savings Harold left behind before he passed away. Daniel had not seen any of it in months. Vanessa always had a reason to cancel visits. Someone had a headache. Someone was busy. Someone already made other plans. Looking back, it was almost impressive how carefully she had separated him from the reality of my life. "She showed me bank confirmations," he said quietly. "Every month." I leaned back slowly in my chair. Outside, the rain had started coming down harder, streaking the parking lot silver beneath the gray morning sky. "Then you should ask to see where those transfers actually went." Another long pause followed. I could feel something cracking inside him now. Not anger yet. Confusion. The painful kind that arrives when trust begins collapsing one small piece at a time. I remembered the first time I met Vanessa nearly 9 years earlier. She wore a cream-colored sweater and carried a homemade apple pie into my kitchen like something out of a magazine advertisement. Polite, soft-spoken, perfect posture. She called me Miss Whitmore for the first 6 months because she said the word mom should be earned. I actually admired that at the time. It felt respectful, thoughtful. Harold had been alive back then. After she left that first evening, he stood at the sink washing dishes while I dried them beside him. "She is careful," he told me quietly. "Women like that usually are." I laughed and accused him of overthinking things. Harold rarely repeated himself when he sensed I disagreed with him. But years later, after Vanessa slowly took over every holiday plan, every financial discussion, every decision involving Daniel, I often remembered the expression on my husband's face that night. Not distrust, concern. The kind a man develops after decades of reading people in business meetings and contract negotiations. "Mom," Daniel said suddenly, his voice strained now, "why would she do that?" I looked toward the framed photograph sitting on the bookshelf across the room. Daniel at 12 years old, standing beside Harold at a fishing dock in Maine, both of them sunburned and smiling proudly over a trout barely longer than my forearm. Back then my son trusted people easily, especially the ones he loved. Because, I answered softly, some people do not steal money for survival. They steal control. After we ended the call, I sat alone at my kitchen table for nearly an hour without moving. The coffee beside me had gone cold, but I kept staring at the steam stains fading from the surface like they might somehow explain how my family had drifted so far from the life Harold and I built together. There is a particular kind of heartbreak that comes with realizing your child did not stop loving you all at once. It happens slowly, quietly, one missed visit at a time, one holiday shortened, one conversation interrupted because somebody else suddenly matters more. Looking back, I could see the pattern now with painful clarity. Vanessa never demanded Daniel choose between us directly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she reshaped the space around him until there was less and less room for me inside it. Around noon my phone rang again. This time Daniel sounded different. Tired. Distracted. I checked our joint account, he said immediately. No greeting. No hesitation. The transfers were real. I closed my eyes briefly. And he exhaled sharply. The money went into another savings account under Vanessa's name. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets wet and shining beneath pale winter sunlight. A delivery truck rolled slowly past my building, while somewhere upstairs a television played loudly through thin apartment walls. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. How much? I asked quietly. He was silent for a moment before answering. Almost $60,000 over 2 years. 60,000. I pressed my fingers gently against my temple. That amount could have repaired my heater, covered my medical bills, allowed me to visit Harold's sister in Arizona before her health declined last spring. Instead, I spent 2 winters layering blankets over my knees, while my son believed he was generously caring for me. She told me you were embarrassed, Daniel said, his voice rough now. She said you begged her not to tell anyone you needed help. I looked around my small townhouse. The faded curtains. The second-hand bookshelf. The old ceramic lamp Harold bought during a road trip through Vermont almost 20 years ago. Suddenly every object around me felt like evidence. Proof of how invisible my struggles had become to the people closest to me. Daniel, I said carefully, when was the last time you actually looked at how I was living? The silence that followed answered the question before he ever spoke. Then quietly, almost like a child again, he said, I thought you were doing fine. I swallowed hard. Not because I wanted to cry. That stage had passed a long time ago. Grief changes shape with age. Eventually it stops arriving as tears and starts settling into your bones instead. Your father used to say something, I murmured. He said people only see what is convenient when they are afraid of the truth. Daniel did not respond immediately, but I heard his breathing shift slightly through the phone. Dad never trusted her completely, did he? He asked at last. I glanced toward Harold's photograph again. The older I became, the more I understood how carefully he observed the world around him. He noticed tensions before arguments started, motives before decisions were made. I used to think he worried too much. Now I wondered how many warnings I ignored simply because I wanted peace inside the family. No, I answered honestly. But he trusted you. That was enough for him. That evening after the phone call ended, I found myself standing in the hallway closet holding Harold's old wool coat against my chest. It still carried the faint scent of cedar and aftershave even after all these years. Sometimes grief hides inside ordinary objects and waits patiently for quiet moments to return. I sat down on the edge of my bed with the coat folded across my lap and thought about the last real conversation Harold and I ever had about Daniel. It happened 3 months before the cancer took him. We were sitting on the back porch watching the sunset turn the trees gold behind our old house. Harold looked tired that evening, thinner than he wanted anyone to notice, but his mind was still sharp. If anything ever happens to me, he said carefully, promise me you will not make yourself smaller just to keep everybody comfortable. At the time I laughed softly and told him he was being dramatic. But now, years later, his words returned with painful clarity because that was exactly what I had done. I made myself smaller. smaller needs, smaller opinions, smaller expectations. Every time Vanessa dismissed me politely, every time Daniel forgot to call, every holiday where I sat quietly at the edge of their lives pretending not to notice the distance growing wider. Around 7 that night my phone buzzed again. A text message from Daniel. Can I come by tomorrow morning? Alone. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. The word alone mattered more than anything else in that message. Of course, I replied. I barely slept that night. Wind rattled softly against the townhouse windows while old memories drifted through my mind in pieces. Daniel at 6 years. Old, running across the front yard holding a plastic baseball bat nearly taller than he was. Daniel at 16 pretending not to cry after Harold taught him how to drive in the church parking lot. Daniel at 24 dancing with me at his wedding reception, while Vanessa smiled for photographs beneath strings of white lights. Back then I truly believed she loved him deeply. Maybe she did in her own way. But some people love through possession instead of partnership. They do not build relationships. They manage them, control them, rearrange them until everyone else slowly disappears from the picture. The next morning, I woke before sunrise and cleaned the townhouse out of habit even though there was almost nothing to clean. I vacuumed the living room carpet, folded blankets, rearranged magazines on the coffee table. Nervous energy has a strange way of making people tidy their pain into neat little corners. By 9:15, Daniel's car pulled into the parking lot outside my building. I watched from the window as he stepped out slowly wearing a navy coat and jeans, his shoulders heavier than I remembered. For a brief moment, he looked less like the successful financial consultant Vanessa always bragged about and more like the uncertain young father who once paced hospital hallways when his daughter Emily was born. I opened the door before he could knock. Neither of us spoke immediately. Daniel just stood there looking past me into the townhouse as though seeing it clearly for the very first time. His eyes moved slowly across the worn furniture, the faded curtains, the patched crack near the ceiling above the hallway. Then he looked back at me, and something inside his expression finally broke. "Mom," he said quietly, almost ashamed. "How long have you been living like this?" For a moment, I almost answered the way mothers often do when their children finally notice the damage. I almost smiled softly and said, "Oh, I am fine." But something inside me had changed during the past 24 hours. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was age finally teaching me that protecting people from guilt sometimes only protects the behavior that caused it. So instead I stepped aside quietly and let Daniel walk into the townhouse without rescuing him from what he saw. He moved slowly through the living room while silence settled between us. His eyes lingered on the old space heater near the couch, the stack of pharmacy receipts beside the lamp, the blanket folded carefully over the armchair because I used it almost every evening when the temperature dropped after sunset. I watched his expression shift with every detail. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a gradual unraveling of assumptions he had carried for years. "Why did you never tell me?" he asked finally. I gave a small shrug and walked toward the kitchen. "Coffee?" He nodded automatically, though he barely seemed aware of the question. While I filled the kettle with water, I noticed him studying the framed photographs on top of the refrigerator. There were not many. One of Harold smiling beside a lake in Maine. One of Daniel holding baby Emily in the hospital. Another from nearly 15 years ago, before Vanessa entered our lives, when family still felt uncomplicated enough to fit inside a photograph without hidden tensions beneath the smiles. "Mom," Daniel said quietly behind me, "I thought you still had money from selling the house." I rested my hands lightly against the kitchen counter. "Most of it went toward Harold's medical bills before he passed away," I explained. "The rest helped me buy this place and cover taxes. Life becomes expensive when you grow older, Daniel, especially when you are alone." He lowered his eyes immediately after that word. Alone. It hung heavily in the kitchen between us. Because deep down, he knew loneliness had not happened naturally. It had been built slowly through absence. Missed calls. Forgotten invitations. Shortened visits that always seemed to end because Vanessa had somewhere else to be. I poured hot water into 2 mugs while Daniel sat carefully at the small table by the window. He looked uncomfortable there. His long legs cramped beneath furniture chosen more for affordability than comfort. Vanessa said you preferred keeping your distance, he admitted after a while. I let out the faintest breath of disbelief. Did that sound like me? He did not answer right away. Instead, he stared down at the coffee cup, warming his hands. No, he said finally. But after a while, I stopped questioning things. The honesty in that sentence hurt more than anger would have. Because he was right. People adapt to emotional distance surprisingly quickly when somebody keeps explaining it away for them. I sat across from him and studied my son carefully. The dark circles beneath his eyes looked deeper than usual. His wedding ring caught the morning light as he turned the coffee mug slowly between his hands, almost distracted by the motion. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain instead of defensive, human instead of managed. I need you to tell me everything, he said quietly. No protecting me. No protecting her. I need the truth. I looked out the window toward the wet parking lot below, remembering all the times I stayed silent because I thought preserving peace mattered more than preserving honesty. Harold used to warn me about that too. Silence does not keep families together, he once told me. It only delays the damage. Slowly I looked back at my son. Then you should know, I said softly. Your wife started isolating you from me long before the money disappeared. Daniel stayed quiet after I said it. He did not interrupt me. He did not defend her. That alone told me more than words could. Morning light drifted through the kitchen window in pale gray stripes while the coffee between us slowly cooled untouched. For years I had imagined this conversation happening differently. I thought if the truth ever came out there would be shouting, denials, anger. But betrayal inside families rarely unfolds dramatically at first. Most of the damage happens in silence, one small manipulation at a time, until the people involved barely recognize how far things have drifted. Do you remember Emily's 8th birthday party? I asked softly. Daniel frowned slightly as he searched his memory. At the country club? I nodded. You told me there was limited seating, and that Vanessa thought it would be easier if I came only for the cake afterward. His face changed immediately. Mom, I believed you. I continued gently. I drove 40 minutes carrying Emily's present in the passenger seat beside me. I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before going inside, because I did not want to arrive too early. I looked down at my hands folded neatly around the coffee mug. When I finally walked in, there were over 30 people there. Daniel's jaw tightened slowly. I remembered that afternoon clearly now. The balloons. The laughter. Vanessa greeting guests effortlessly in a pale blue dress while waiters carried trays of lemonade and sandwiches through the room. I also remembered the quick flash of irritation across her face when she saw me standing near the entrance holding a gift bag with pink tissue paper sticking out of the top. Oh, she had said lightly, kissing the air beside my cheek instead of actually touching me. You came early. At the time, I convinced myself it was a misunderstanding. Mothers become experts at explaining away pain when it involves their children. There were other things too, I said quietly. The canceled Christmas dinners. The vacations you suddenly forgot to mention. The weekends when Emily had dance recitals, but somehow I never got the correct schedule. Daniel rubbed his hand slowly across his face. He looked exhausted now. Older somehow. I thought those things just happened, he admitted. Vanessa always handled the planning. I gave a faint nod because that was exactly how control works when done skillfully enough. Nobody notices the pattern until years have already disappeared. Do you know what hurt the most? I asked softly. He looked up at me then, his eyes tired and uncertain. It was not being excluded, I said. It was watching you slowly become comfortable with it. The honesty of that sentence settled heavily between us. Daniel lowered his gaze immediately, unable to hold eye contact. I could see shame moving across his expression now in quiet waves. Not because he was cruel. My son was never cruel. But weakness inside families can wound people just as deeply as cruelty when it allows the wrong person to shape everything around them. After a long silence, Daniel finally spoke again. There is something else you should know. His voice sounded strained now, almost hesitant. Last year Vanessa told me you asked her not to leave me alone with you because you thought I was becoming distant from the family. I stared at him across the table, stunned by the precision of it. It was not just money she had stolen. It was trust, conversation, access. She had quietly rewritten the emotional history between a mother and her son while both of us were still living inside it. Daniel swallowed hard before continuing. I believed her. Hearing those words should have made me angry, but strangely they did not. By that point, anger felt too heavy to carry anymore. What I felt instead was something quieter. A deep sadness for all the years we lost because two people who loved each other stopped speaking honestly. I looked at my son sitting across from me in my tiny kitchen. His shoulders slumped forward, his coffee untouched and growing cold, and I suddenly saw how tired he truly was. Not just tired from work or marriage or stress. Tired from living inside someone else's version of reality for so long that he no longer trusted his own instincts. Why would she tell you that? I asked gently. Daniel shook his head slowly. She said you blamed her for everything. That you thought she stole me away from the family. His voice cracked slightly on the word family. She said she was trying to protect our marriage from conflict. I gave a faint, tired smile at that because manipulation often sounds reasonable when wrapped carefully enough in concern. Did you ever notice, I asked quietly, that the conflicts always seemed to involve distancing you from people who loved you before she came along? Daniel looked down immediately. I could almost see memories rearranging themselves inside his mind now. Thanksgiving dinner shortened because Vanessa suddenly felt unwell. Birthday calls interrupted because she needed help with something urgent. Weekends canceled. Invitations forgotten. Conversations redirected. Tiny moments that looked harmless individually, but devastating when placed together side by side. I thought marriage meant putting your wife first, he said after a long silence. It does. I answered softly. But healthy love does not require someone else to disappear. That sentence seemed to hit him harder than anything else I had said all morning. He leaned back in the chair slowly and covered part of his face with his hand. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then very quietly he said, Emily barely knows you anymore. That hurt. More than the money. More than the lies. Because it was true. My granddaughter used to spend weekends baking cookies in my kitchen and watching old musicals beside Harold on rainy afternoons. After Vanessa entered the picture fully, those visits became rarer each year until eventually Emily only saw me during carefully managed family events where conversation stayed polite and brief. Last Christmas she hugged me awkwardly like a distant relative instead of the grandmother who once braided her hair before preschool every Friday morning. That was not your fault alone, I said carefully. Children follow the emotional maps adults create for them. Daniel's eyes looked wet now, though he blinked quickly as if embarrassed by it. He had always hated crying in front of people, even as a little boy. I do not know what to do, he admitted quietly. I studied him for a moment before answering because this part mattered. Pain inside families often creates pressure for immediate decisions. Immediate blame. Immediate destruction. But life is rarely repaired through emotional explosions. First, I said calmly, you stop pretending this is confusion when it is deception. He nodded slowly. Second, you start asking questions she cannot redirect. Another nod. Then I leaned forward slightly and lowered my voice. And third, Daniel, you prepare yourself for the possibility that you only know part of the truth. His expression changed instantly after that. Concern replaced exhaustion for the first time all morning. What do you mean? I hesitated briefly before answering because I had spent months convincing myself I was imagining things. But now, with the lies about money exposed, those instincts no longer felt irrational. They felt overdue. 3 months ago, I said carefully, Vanessa asked me strange questions about your father's will. Daniel stared at me across the kitchen table, as though he was no longer certain he understood the woman he married. The confidence he carried when he first walked into the townhouse that morning had disappeared completely now. In its place was something far more fragile. Doubt. What kind of questions? He asked carefully. I folded my hands together in my lap and thought back to that afternoon 3 months earlier. Vanessa had invited herself over unexpectedly, which alone felt unusual. She rarely visited me without Daniel present. At first she behaved the way she always did in public settings. Polite smile. Careful tone. Compliments that sounded warm until you realized they never contained real affection. She brought lemon pastries from an expensive bakery downtown, and spent nearly 20 minutes talking about Emily's school fundraiser, before the conversation slowly shifted. You and Harold were always so organized financially, she said while stirring artificial sweetener into her tea. Did he leave everything simple when he passed? I remember pausing because something about the question felt rehearsed. Simple enough, I answered cautiously. Vanessa nodded thoughtfully. Daniel worries sometimes that legal things become messy after parents get older. Parents get older. Not you get older. Not your mother gets older. The wording sounded detached, almost clinical. There is not much to worry about, I told her. Your father-in-law made sure everything was clear. She smiled then. Small. Controlled. So the house money and investments are fully settled? At the time, I convinced myself she was asking out of practical concern. Married couples discuss finances. Families plan ahead. But now, sitting across from my son while pieces finally connected, I understood the conversation differently. What investments? Daniel asked sharply. I looked at him steadily. The retirement account your father set aside before he died. His forehead tightened immediately. Mom, I thought most of that went toward medical bills. Most of it did, I answered. Not all. Silence settled heavily across the kitchen again. I had never hidden that information from Daniel intentionally. After Harold passed away, everything became emotionally exhausting. Paperwork, taxes, lawyers. Grief itself felt like a full-time occupation. When Daniel stopped asking questions about my life, I stopped volunteering details that made him uncomfortable. How much are we talking about? He asked quietly. I hesitated because money changes people once numbers become real enough to imagine. Enough for me to live carefully without depending on anyone, I answered at last. His expression shifted immediately after that sentence. Not greed. Relief. Relief that his mother had not secretly been destitute all this time. But then confusion followed close behind it. Did Vanessa know? He asked. I nodded slowly. She knew there was money somewhere. I never gave specifics. Daniel leaned back heavily in his chair and stared toward the kitchen window. Outside, clouds had started rolling in again, turning the late morning sky pale and heavy above the parking lot. Oh my God, he muttered under his breath. What? I asked softly. He looked back at me then, and for the first time all day, genuine fear appeared in his eyes. Last month Vanessa asked me if your will had been updated since Dad passed away. My chest tightened immediately. What exactly did she ask? Daniel swallowed hard before answering. She wanted to know whether Emily was listed as your primary beneficiary. The room suddenly felt colder despite the heat humming weakly through the vents. I stared at my son carefully, every instinct inside me now painfully awake. Because mothers learn something over time that younger people rarely understand. When someone spends years separating you emotionally from your family while quietly studying your finances, it is never only about hurt feelings. And that's the end of today's story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.